So we have the last session, which is a very different kind of theme, and in some way, we are going to see if it connects to the theme of making India an advanced country, but not necessarily so. It's about Indian Americans and how well they have done here. And I'd like to invite Arun Kumar. He's the managing partner of Celesta Capital. He's a former CEO or president and CEO of KPMG in India, so he knows India very well. He was also the assistant secretary in the Obama administration for commerce, so he knows trade very well. So Arun, I'd like to invite you to come and introduce the two speakers, Meena and Devesh.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here. And what a tremendous conference has been put together. It's been like drinking from a fire hose of wonderful information. So it's been really great. So really wonderful to be with all of you. But so, as I just said, this is going to be a very different kind of a session. Hopefully it will add to everything we heard or add another dimension. And the topic is Indian Americans. And we've got two great speakers on the topic. But just to set a bit of do some stage setting, I was just thinking when I came to the US in the late 70s to study at MIT, in the entire New England area, there were probably 5,000 Indians, maybe 5,000 total. And at MIT itself, there was Hargobind Khurana, the Nobel laureate. There was Amar Bose. And then you suddenly, and there were a couple of younger people, but there wasn't that many folks in the faculty either. I got elected to be the president of the Indian association called Sangam at MIT. And I discovered that altogether there were about 100 students of Indian origin at MIT. And then a couple of years later, I moved to the Bay Area, which is where I met Ajay. And at Stanford and Berkeley also, there were just a handful of Indian American professors. And again, in the whole area from San Jose to Sacramento, there were probably 5,000 Indians. Now, fast forward 4 decades and how things have changed. I mean, you've got 1% of the American population being of Indian origin, 4 million people. So it's just been a tremendous change. And nobody would have imagined at that point that this 1% of the population would include leaders in so many different fields. And this is what we will hear about more when Meena speaks. Today also, the people-to-people connections between the US and India are a strong foundation of the US-India relationship. And this is well understood both in India and in the US. The demographic strength of the Indian Americans, the wealthiest, the best educated, the most professionally accomplished ethnic groups, these have led to commensurate political influence, which hopefully will increase. Indian Americans have become increasingly visible in US political life with larger numbers holding elected office. I mean, this was not the case just 30 years ago. And we've also seen the Indian American community play a major role in some important issues like the civil nuclear agreement. Similarly, the rise of Indian Americans and their visibility and their successes have led to changes in American perceptions of India. India today is seen in a very different light than it used to be in the past. So many old stereotypes have died away because of that. So let me go into our speakers. Meenakshi Ahmed. She's had a rich career as a journalist, and she was also previously at the World Bank. Her first book, A Matter of Trust, was a seminal contribution to understanding the dynamics of the US-India relationship. And her op-eds and articles have been published in the Asian Age, Seminar, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Her recent book, which is what her talk today will be about, Indian Genius, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America, is a timely work as we see Indian origin Americans visibly climb the ladders of success in diverse fields. So copies of Meena's book are available at the reception, so make sure you have a chance to get them. Devesh Kapoor, I haven't seen him yet. Ah, good. Devesh is a distinguished scholar of the Indian diaspora, particularly Indian Americans, or of the diaspora, but particularly Indian Americans. His research explores their migration, socio-economic success, internal diversity, political engagement, and transnational connections with India. Devesh's work is notable for its empirical rigor and for providing a nuanced, data-driven understanding of this rapidly growing and influential community. His books include Diaspora, Democracy and Development, The Impact of International Migration from India on India, and The Other 1%, Indians in America, which he co-wrote with Sanjoy Chakravarti and Nirvikar Singh. So Meena and Devesh look at the Indian American phenomenon from different perspectives. Meena relates the stories of individuals who've been extremely successful, a thin slice of the community where success has been phenomenal. And Devesh's work takes a holistic view of the community and its challenges of integration, including social, linguistic, political, and class differences. So the way we'll conduct this meeting will be that now Meena will speak, following which we'll hear from Devesh, and then we'll come up here and have a discussion with questions from the audience. So over to you, Meena.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Ajay, and to all of you for being here this very late in the afternoon. And I know you've had a very long day and a lot to think about. And thank you, Arun, for that warm introduction. It's a real honor to be present here with Devesh because I only met him yesterday, but as I told him, I've been carrying him around with me for 2.5, 3 years, maybe more, because his books have been an inspiration and also a bit of a Bible. His books have been like a mentor to me for this particular book, and he's quite a giant in the field. So thank you, Devesh, for all the amazing work that you've done, because I couldn't have written my book without all of your work. My book is really about, I'll tell you how it started. When I was writing my previous book about the US-India relationship, that's another one of these big books, 600 pages, and it traces the 70-year history. When I was working on the nuclear deal, I was having a conversation with some of the principals who had worked on the nuclear deal, and they had told me about an incident in which they were having trouble getting this civil deal through Congress. And so the ambassador had called the Indians into his office and said to them that, look, I need your help. I need you to go out and do what you can to persuade your congressmen, your senators, and everybody else to get this passed. And he said, I'm not telling you what to do, but just do whatever is legal and try and get this, try and help us. And this was now in 2006. Indians now had become quite wealthy and had reached a level of economic security in this country. And they actually fanned out and held fundraisers. They met with their congressmen and senators, and they actually did quite a bit to persuade them that they could deliver votes and that they were powerful. And they had, so when I was writing this particular section, I realized that Indians had found their political voice. And when I finished the book 2-3 years later, well, actually quite a few years later, 2021, I began to, I saw that Indians were everywhere. They were now CEOs of big companies, Microsoft and Google and everywhere else. And I realized that a story had to be written about how powerful they had become. And so when I finished my previous book, I started on this one almost immediately. This book is really about success. And everyone wants to know how do people become successful? People are really curious about what does it take to become, how do you become CEO of a big company like Microsoft? So part of what this book is, it's not, the Devesh's book tells you a lot about the research, about the sort of demographics of people. This book, I decided to interview people and find out how did they become successful? How did they reach the top? What did it take? What were their obstacles? What inspired them? What was that special ingredient that made them succeed? And I divided my book into 3 sections to see where Indians had had a major impact in this country. So it was tech, medicine, and public policy, leaders in the public arena. And I felt, and I'll give you an example. For example, someone like Atul Gawande, who maybe many of you have heard about. When he wrote Checklist Manifesto, it brought infection rates down in hospitals in this country by something like 60%. I mean, that was a pretty transformational thing. He really had a huge impact on the entire medical industry in this country. And again, his book, Being Mortal, had a very big impact on how people in this country began to think about the end of life care. 90% of, something above 90% of the end of, expenses are spent in the, last 2 years of life. So that was not insignificant. So I picked 3 areas. I limited myself to 3 areas, and I picked 5 significant people in each so people could get to know them. And so I tried to get out of the way so that, the readership could really have a chance to really hear people in their own words and get to know how they got to where they were. So there are obviously some explanations about immigration in this country and some other additional things. For example, the title, what is genius? What makes for genius? And every time I go to India, I see parents, sitting over their children's heads, trying to get their kids into IIT. And is that the way to success? I mean, is that what makes children succeed, getting into IIT? And it turns out, not really. Satya Nadella didn't get into IIT, neither did Shantanu Narayan. But here they are running the biggest companies in the US. And so I wanted to break some of these myths, and so that other people would feel inspired and see that there are other routes to success. So anyway, that's what the book is about, and I want to hand this over to Devesh because he has so much to add and so much substantial information to give us, and then we can open it up to questions because I'm sure you'll have questions.
Thank you, Meena. If you haven't read the book, it's just a wonderful stories in the book, and I wish I could write so nicely. It has a bit of a flavor of Sunil Khilnani's book, Incarnation, India in 50 Lives. So some of you have, read it. It's just worth sort of reading on a relaxed day. My remarks will be, I'll have a few just one remark sort of on the book, which is on the title of the book. The second is more about Indian Americans here, more broadly. And the third is, which relates to the conference, what has been the impact on India? So on the first, I was curious that the book, the title, but the lives that Meena so well chronicles are in tech, in medicine, and and influencers, so healers and influencers. Now, the word genius is an interesting word as to what does it actually mean. Our president says he's a genius, and that's a pretty liberal use of that word. Uh, what I was curious about, and we can have a conversation, is that none of the Indian Americans who made contributions in science are included in. So as an academic, being much more narrow-minded, I would think of Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, the great astrophysicist, as someone I would say as genius, or Manjul Bhargava, the great mathematician who's got the Fields Medal, one of only two people of Indian origin. The other is in Australia, who've got the Fields Medal. Whereas Nikki Haley, successful, yes. Genius? So should the title have been Indian Success, which is true of all of the people you chronicle? Genius, well, some people have a genius at being successful. Take our president, that's a good example. But so it's just the etymology of the title. Now, one of the things that we always want to ask is, why has the community been so successful? The three plausible sort of academic answers is it culture, is it selection, or is it treatment? Now, for culture, just to give you a quote, in the mid-1970s, there's a debate in the Indian Parliament about Indians going to America and leaving the country. So there was an irrepressible parliamentarian from the opposition called Pilu Modi. So Pilu Modi asks in Parliament, addressing Mrs. Gandhi, who's then the Prime Minister, that can the Prime Minister inform the House, why is it that Indians are successful economically under every government except hers? Now, that in a sense also tells you that, look, it can't per se be culture, because if it was culture, India would be way more successful. After all, that's where most Indians live. And if India had been much more successful, people wouldn't leave in the first place. So culture, perhaps, but not fully. Selection. Now, there's no doubt, and I show in a new book that is coming out, which actually might be thicker than Karthik's. It all depends on the size of the font that you use. Is no country has had as much of its best and brightest leave after World War II than India, and has been as proud and blasé that its best and brightest leave as India. It is remarkable that a country is so happy and thrilled that its people do well outside without asking the question, why can't they do it here? And in the selection also, normally in migration work, of course, you look at the variables that you can measure, which is usually education, right? And so basically, until the H-1B visa, but the ones that came like in your generation in the 70s, 80s, it was not 1 out of 100, it was 1 out of 10,000. When you have that acute selection, that group is going to be good. It doesn't matter which population you're drawing. If you're drawing 1 out of 10,000, that individual will have what it takes to succeed in most contexts. But there might be other things which are harder to measure, what we call non-observables. Grit, honesty. There are a whole lot of other variables that attributes people carry, of which education is just one of them. Now, the third is not selection, but treatment. So imagine the same group of people had gone to two other very successful countries. I'm talking the 70s, 80s, Japan or Germany. Would they have done as well? I think most of us would think unlikely, right? So you need a combination of these factors, right? Because a society has to be reasonably open to allow this. And I would say continental Europe would have been much, much harder. In general, where we see Indian migration, it's heavily skewed, very heavily skewed to Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, Canada, UK, and the US. However, there's a serious shift taking place right now, especially of students, which tells you what's going to happen 10 years down the road. That's happening in Germany in particular, but continental Europe for the first time. Now, one question that I'm asked is, the largest group of students who've come to the US are from China and India. Why do we see far more successful Indian leadership in American companies and far fewer from China? Now, you know, people come up, there are papers from Sloan School, etc. You know, it's about some cultural attributes, the way Indians, you know, we like to talk a lot, Americans like to talk a lot, and, you know, being able to speak well, etc. in English, you know, it so happened both the US and India were colonized by the same power, etc., etc. But let me give you a different explanation, which we haven't been able to show, and I'll tell you why, but is a reverse selection. Is it the case that the best Chinese Indian students come to the US, stay here, and build American companies? The best Chinese students come here and go back in China and build Chinese companies. And the larger effects, if you see, of migration of the Chinese diaspora's effects on China and the Indian diaspora's effects in India, they are substantially different. The Indian diaspora from the US hardly has done very little in FDI. Its investments are in non-tradables, in real estate, and in the equity markets. The Chinese diaspora, 70% of all FDI in China until the 90s was from the overseas Chinese from Taiwan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia. The export success of China began with Chinese diaspora FDI in China. The Indian diaspora in the US actually amplified the bias in India against manufacturing, because they failed. The Chinese diaspora overseas, they made the success in manufacturing, and they exported those attributes to mainland China, which helped China also do well in manufacturing. The Indian diaspora came here because we failed in manufacturing. They came here and they got much more in services, especially, of course, tech. It so happened that tech was just booming. They didn't have to climb the stairs. They got on an escalator. But as a result of their success in IT, which is manifest, they exported what they were now good at, which is tech, back to India. And of course, we know India has done very well in tech. But that further amplified the bias, because no one that I know of, all my friends in IITs who teach, none of their students wants to go to manufacturing. Talent in India does not want to touch manufacturing. And this is not just manufacturing. If I'm looking at, which I am, at civil engineering in India, you don't get good civil engineers. You're turning out is the guys right at the bottom who are going to civil engineering. And when you see the quality of construction in India, you can see why. So the question is to ask is, on when we look at the, to me, in the work that I do, I think the single biggest pernicious effect of Indian migration to the US on India has been higher education. Indian higher education, its weaknesses really stemmed was that the first-rate people left. And when you have second-rate people as faculty, they teach and become third-rate people. Which is why between 2000 and 2024, India started almost five new colleges a day. Every day for the past 25 years, 365 days a year. Now you can imagine who's the faculty there. At India's elite universities, we talked of the IITs, the faculty vacancy rate in IITs is 45%. You can imagine what's down the line. And those are the inability to generate talent. Many of you are in economics. Can we think of 5 good macroeconomists in India today? Who would, be? India had way more talent in its institutions in economics in the 50s and 60s when it was a much poorer country than today. Look what has happened to the Delhi School of Economics. So now there's a reason why, higher education is a services sector. We say India is good at services. If India is good in services, why today 1.3 million young Indians are studying abroad? That's a huge number. You meet middle-class families in India. Everyone, what they're talking about is how to get their kid out of India to study somewhere else. When the Ukraine war started, the Indian embassy had no idea in Kiev that there were 24,000 Indian students studying in Ukraine. And in our data, what we see is just forget the US. I mean, they are all over the world because wherever they can get something, they feel it's better than India. Because the talent left. And there was no one to really reproduce and build the good institutions. Because higher education, if you don't have talent in your faculty, the software is everything. So I think, now there's no doubt of all the good things which you have said. US-India relations and tech, the collaborations. Surprisingly, what we find is that if you look at data, and this is from the NSF, on collaborations on papers, on academic papers, right now, many more academic, especially in the sciences, are written across borders. Academic collaboration between the US and Chinese academics is 10 times larger than between American and Indian academics, even though there are way more faculty of Indian origin in the US. And the reason is you need talent to collaborate with talent. There's no doubt that China has built a vastly better R&D ecosystem than India has, which is why there is more collaboration. So my own somewhat less optimistic view of this is that in a world in which science and technology is becoming ever more important, human capital is becoming ever more important for development outcomes. India, and it's a long story, which we can get into some other time, but the way India has really almost criminally neglected its higher education system. By the way, this extends to every political party. And of course, there are good universities, private, etc., that they're coming up. But again, what matters is we always focus on the IITs, the All India Institutes, all of that. The total number of intake of IITs now with 23 IITs is 10,000 students a year. The total number of Indians in higher education is 35 million. We should think a country of that size cannot just rely on such tiny numbers. I might have taken too much time, so I'll stop here. Thanks.
Maybe I'll start with the first, with a question, which is about the impact of Indian Americans on India. So, as you remember, early days of India's independence, there was a big push by Nehru to bring talented Indians back to India. Homi Bhabha followed in that. And there was a whole wave for the first decade or so of attracting expatriate Indians to come back and contribute in India. So now we have the situation where we've got very talented Indian Americans, large numbers of them. What should be done to harness that resource for India's advancement, to come back to the theme of today's conference? So maybe both of you.
Well, I will let Devesh, because he's written the book about the brain drain, and so let him give you that answer.
So what we see is that, well, one is if President Trump continues with his policies, that will be itself will lead,
Right.
because you won't get jobs here, you won't get visas, et cetera, et cetera. So it might happen more by default rather than by design. A second is, I should have added that actually in the last decade or so, you do see talent going back, but it is because now a lot of excellent R&D is being done in the subsidiaries of MNCs in India. Some of the GCCs, for instance, the Global Capability Centers, they have absolutely, in fact, 10% of IBM's patents are filed from IBM's research lab in India. And so what we see is that we see a talent going back where they have, world-class facilities, an environment of research and so on. Just very recently, the Indian government formed for the first time the Indian analog of the NSF, the National Science, with precisely this goal. And I was very gratified that the person they've chosen to head is not the usual IAS, is not the usual university, but came from Microsoft, who had worked here, who had done his PhD in all of his work, and he's a leading computer science guy, etc. And because I've been speaking with him on this. And so at least recognizes, sees the thing, how to foster talent research in India. So it's not that it's not recognized, but especially at the state government level, and this is a question that we could have asked for Karthik, if he allowed us some time, that state chief ministers have just no interest in research and higher education. I mean, other than it's all about access, it's all about the gross numbers. So actually, relative to its per capita income, India is a complete outlier on the fraction of young people in higher education. It should be way, way less. But basically, higher education has become something you do because you don't have anything else to do, rather than the way we traditionally think about higher education. So the return, some of it is happening. Some might happen by default, some by design. But it's not happening in ways that are large enough to rejuvenate Indian higher education institutions.
But just to make one point that relates to the conference, starting with the ambassador's speech and going through, they've been talking about education and building and, being competitive in AI, down to Karthik's point about the lack of state effectiveness. I mean, one of the big problems, and I didn't have the opportunity to ask the question of either the ambassador or the second session, was, China has built 50 centers dedicated to AI education, right? I mean, they have massive investments in research centers and training people in the latest technology. India doesn't have that. We're not competitive with that. We still, and to their point, with Karthik's point of state effectiveness, our educational system, the teachers don't show up. even if you look at our best institutions, which is IIT, if you look at IIT's quality on a global scale and measure it, it's not rated in even the top 20 globally. So it puts out very good engineers, and you have, in India, it's obviously the best, but if you rate it internationally, it's not among the top 10 or 20 institutions. So you worry that there's a lot of talk about India's educational institutions, India's development, but actually the reality doesn't quite match up. So what you're saying about these students who, we have this great capacity, so maybe the excess, they export to the US, because I'm not sure that there's this absorptive capacity in India, and we're back to the 60s where they were going overseas.
I want to pick up on what Devesh said about the global capability centers. I think that's a really important phenomenon where every major US technology corporation and other tech corporations have centers in India that are actually doing leading edge product development, technology development, creating patterns. And in some sense, that is a bit of the answer to what's happening in China.
Right. But that's where they're learning. They're not learning it at the universities.
But they are learning there.
Yeah.
And then what happens is, like in Silicon Valley, and this is the business that I'm right now in, people spin out. They say, okay, you know what? I can design the circuit and have my own company to build it. They step out. There's venture capital available, and not enough though. There needs to be a lot more, like maybe 1,000 times more. But with the little that is available, people do step out and build potentially world-class companies. So we have companies now in India that are born in India that come to the US and then they go global. So we're seeing that is the way I think the Indian model of technology development may well be through that route.
Yeah, through private systems.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, cool, plenty. So let's just maybe start with there. Okay, yeah, sure.
Maybe a comment and a question. So when we talk about Indian Americans or Indians of American origin, from my point of view, there are, I think, 3 waves, right? One is we talked about a very highly selective group that came in the 60s and the 70s, very well integrated in the American society because it was such a small group. And we have this new influx, I think, since the last 10 years, which is, I think, a very different socioeconomic cultural profile. And now an emerging group of second-generation Indian Americans that are really rising. So I think even when we talk about this community, we are talking about 3 very distinct profiles, right?
Yeah, I've talked about it in the book. Yeah.
So my question actually is slightly different. I think rightly, the community is doing very well for itself, and we are very proud of it. But I'm curious if either in your work, which is more micro, and Devesh, of course, your work, if we've also taken a look at what is the external perception of the community. And I guess what strikes me more is as we get more wealthy, we get more politically powerful, how are we projecting into the US society, and how does that society see the Indian community? And frankly, what can we do to make sure that we are looked upon, that we don't fall into the other side, which is the resentment towards the Chinese communities or some other communities that has emerged as those have become more prominent or powerful?
You want to take that, Devesh?
So there are sort of 3 elements how historically America has seen new waves of immigrants. One is the relationship with the country of origin. If the relationship with the country of origin is very negative, that is going to have a perception on the immigrants from that country. So when the US, if you take, so this is from the US Census, if you ask, when the Census Bureau asks, at sort of country of origin, as opposed to, which country, meaning your forefathers, the largest group in the US is actually German. But if you look at the record how Germans or Americans of German origin, how they reacted, had to change their identities, etc., in World War I and World War II, when the US was at war with Germany. You see how America's relations with the country of origin affect how the community is perceived here, right? And the same with the Japanese internment, Japanese Americans. They were Americans, but of Japanese, but when they went to war, you know. A second is of course how whether the group is seen as what I call a fiscal burden, right? So if you are so in the 70s, if you went to the UK, the perception of people, of Indians living in the UK was quite negative, because those who had left to go to the UK were actually working class in the 50s and 60s. So when you go to Heathrow Airport, people will always remark that all the cleaners, etc., were all of Indian origin, right? Whereas here, the first impression of the median American about Indians came through their doctor, right? Because in the early 70s, 1 out of 12 of every new doctor in the US was from India, right? We're talking of that long back. So if you had never met an Indian before in Oklahoma, the first time you met an Indian was he or she was your doctor. So that was a reputational building mechanism. A third is, of course, which is what I see now, and what is the real danger, is if there's a politics of resentment, which always comes in any country of a small group that is very successful and somehow doesn't fit into the political narrative of one of the political parties, right? So in general, in the West, there's a strong or growing anti-immigrant sentiment, and there's no way that Indians can avoid being dragged into it as much as any other immigrant group, right? And so I think if that politics grows and prevails, I have zero doubt that the resentment will also be fanned, and there will be more serious repercussions.
So I'll just add something to that. So, in the after around World War I, immigration to this country was basically up until 1960 was around, it was 75% white. And, it started out at quite high rates after World War I and World War II. It was at 13%. By 1970, it had dropped down to around 4.7%, but it was 75% white. After 1970, it started to switch, and now it's 75 to 80% brown, and it's only 15% white. So there's a remarkable shift, and it's gone back up from like 4.7 to like 13% again. It's like pretty high rates of immigration, but everyone coming in is brown. And so that assimilation, even though the Italians were poor and they were discriminated, all of them have been discriminated against. The Jews were discriminated against, the Irish were discriminated against, but eventually they blended in as they achieved, some economic standing and security, they blended in. I think, the brown people and Black people have had a harder time. Indians are they're outliers because they are the highest, they have the highest per capita income, they have the highest educational levels of any immigrant community. But whenever you have, we're now, as Devesh said, it's, 1% of the population. We're almost 5 million now, 5-point-something million. And by the way, Carnegie and Devesh, his group, his team has done an amazing study, statistics of Indian American attitudes in America. I suggest you all go on that site and take a look at it. It's voting behavior. It's how, Indians, how they want to be treated as minorities. It's all kinds of interesting data, and it's a really great study. It's been done in 3 phases. It's a fascinating study. But so I think there's bound to be, whether you're successful or not, I think there's bound to be some amount of discrimination when you're sort of different to the general population. And then when you have politicians that sort of tell people that you're going to be overrun, that you're the white population is in danger of being taken over, then obviously that whips up a certain sentiment, even if you are very successful in making contributions.
So let me maybe we'll take the next few questions together.
Yeah.
And then at the end of this time, Devesh, maybe you want to talk about the study that Meena referred to. So let's just take from here the question. We'll just go this way. Maybe Shekhar, and then Indra, and we'll just come.
Thank you. This is a question for Devesh. Arvind talked about Tamil Nadu and talked about Apple and you talked about the GCCs. Do you see a spread effect from that with the best Indian engineers, for example, getting attracted to these locations because of the conditions under which they can work? And then that has a knock-on effect all the way down into institutions of higher learning. And what might politicians do, particularly state politicians, to promote that?
So this is a question for all three. Devesh and so I was just saying, what is the one quality that you would say, why were Indians successful? If you are from all the research and interviews. And for you, Arun, now arguably, Devesh, what you were saying, people going back and, contributing. Maybe Arun is one of the outstanding examples who actually went back for 5 years and got some of the practices over here in KPMG. What was it that you saw, or what was it, the gap that you saw that you felt that you better helped fill?
This, first of all, a small observation. As an engineer, I feel if you say who's the best engineer, he'd be a person interested in engineering. Who's the most efficient, effective engineer? He often is least interested in engineering, but wants to get the job done well. I feel when we define, even in the space of technology or STEM, and valorize, say, the IITs, I can say that in my personal experience, the difference between a person who went into IIT and a person who went into a different school, let's call it a tier 2 school, just without making it a pejorative, the person who got into IIT was extremely good at test taking. They had fast reflexes. So that is the selection that puts somebody into an IIT. I can tell you from practical experience that those people who are very good at test taking and get into IIT, their persistence in engineering is extraordinarily low. At the first chance, they'll do a PhD in economics or in sociology. They are multi-talented people, perhaps. And maybe when you talk about Satya Nadella not getting into IIT, etc., really Satya Nadella should be evaluated not on the merit of whether he did or did not get into IIT, but at what age was his talent for management expressed or observable. I feel we are using wrong metrics to try to evaluate the success of this crowd. And I leave you with this provocative observation that or two provocative observations. One, that India's development is perhaps because of the exodus of that brain talent that didn't come up with some highly argumentative but pointless academic view as to where India should go. Maybe by getting them out of the country could develop. I leave you that one provocative observation. The second point is like to think about America as a Noah's Ark. There are 2 Ethiopians, 2 Indians, 2 Ghanaians, 2 Nigerians in every corporate environment. And perhaps it is under those circumstances that the Indians excel, and you put them all in the same room. They all go to IIT or St. Stephen's, and none of them can decide on what to do, and nothing gets done.
Yeah, well, up here. Sanjay.
Yeah, thank you. So Devesh, you paint, of course, a very bleak, the picture is very bleak and depressing from what you're saying in terms of Indian quality, higher education, and so on. So my my question to you is India large enough to afford, you're saying, you know, the brain drain has been massive. I haven't read your book, so apologies on that. But is India large enough to afford this brain drain is one question. And related to that is that, you know, Arun talked about GCCs and the perhaps different model of, is there any bright, what do you see as the bright spot in all of this, in the picture you're painting, right? So higher education is bad, except in the very, very elite, but is there something more broadly which is more hopeful? And the other question about India's size and the brain drain.
And the last one, and here, and then now after that, we're going to answer Karthik style. Could be only 5 minutes.
JP Hogan, we started this morning with the Tata executive quoting like the Tata family, saying like the company, I'm not sure he quite said it, but the company wanted to be good for India maybe before it was good for the bottom line. I'm just wondering, is it a kinder and gentler model of executive that India is producing, not necessarily a corporate raider? Is there some cultural, is it an emotional IQ if you're measuring genius? So just, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Okay. So maybe you can start with the last question.
Yeah, well, I can, I think certainly Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella have brought a very different management style. And that maybe you could say some of that is cultural. It was a very toxic atmosphere at Google before, and at Microsoft. I mean, I think Bill Gates now admits to the fact that you know, he was infamous. There are lots of quotes in my book about various incidences, and all that changed dramatically after these two people took over. And they allowed people the space to be able to express themselves. They didn't belittle them. So yeah, I mean, I think that was a very nurturing and encouraging atmosphere. And certainly under Satya Nadella, who I think is quite a visionary, look, at one point in the last 3 months, Microsoft became the most profitable country on the planet. It even exceeded Apple. So I think he, you know, it was floundering a bit under Steve Ballmer, but he really took it to great heights. And I think he's always trying to see around the corner and trying to look at the next big thing. So he's a real visionary, in my opinion, to answer your question. And I think that, and just to talk about the book's title a little bit, it's not so much individual genius as much as it's when you talk about the genius of the Indian people or the genius of, you know, the American people or the genius of the British people. It's really, that's more the implication of the book. It's a collective genius, if you will.
So I think I'll start with yours, and then the really optimistic part is that the base is now so large. So in the 70s, when you had this real brain drain going on, right, from the IITs, et cetera, at that time, from the top IITs, it was, and AIMS, for instance, was 52%. 1 out of 2 of every AIMS graduate left. In the IITs, we found that it's not just that the top IITs, that the top rankers in the IITs left. And then when you look at the top high school exams in the higher secondary, when we collated those who scored highest in the high school exams, forget the IITs, where they are now, more than half are outside. Now, because the base compared in the 70s when you had this brain drain, there were less than 1 million students in higher education. Now there are 35 million. So if 1% is leaving, let's say the top, it's 35 times larger the base. So the pool is much deeper. It's not only that, I think one difference that has happened, and partly also this government has pushed it, is there's a much greater recognition and social acceptance of entrepreneurship. Among many elites in India in the 60s and 70s, entrepreneurship was frowned upon. It's something done by Marwaris or Gujaratis, Whereas now it's something, when people talk of startups, then suddenly it has a different cachet. In a way, it was just impossible 50 years ago. So I think that's another. The third bright spot is you really have some very good new private institutions coming up. You may not have heard of, but if we take Ahmedabad University or Indian Institute of Human Settlements, I mean, these are genuinely very good. I don't want to use the word world class. I don't know what it means, but nonetheless. The fourth is that young Indians themselves are much more empowered because of the availability of MOOCs. If you are a bright student and your teacher is not good, you can actually learn about chemistry or physics just by going on the net. There's a lot more stuff now. So motivated students don't have to despair as much that they don't have good teachers because they have access to much greater sources of good information. There's so much stuff on the net that students can learn from. So I think all of these factors together, to me, means that the traditional way we thought of talent being coming from higher education, the classic ways, that's not the way India is going to go. It's going to go through all these multiple other pathways rather than the traditional brick and mortar, Patna University graduate. Now, I think we too exaggerate the IITs. Some of you might know IIT Kanpur, in the 1960s, the US government and USAID went to MIT to help build two good engineering institutions. They went to IIT Kanpur, the other was BITS Pilani. 5 years later, or 7 years later, I forget, MIT undertook an internal study. How well did we do? And now the study is interesting because it says and it starts off with saying that it is said that when a student physically enters the gates of IIT Kanpur the first time, his soul already ascends to the United States. This is the first line of the report. And they said the BITS Pilani students, a far greater fraction, have stayed behind in India and have built Indian firms. So they asked themselves, IIT Kanpur has been great for the United States. BITS Pilani has been great for India. Did MIT succeed or did it fail? And they leave it as a question. And I thought it's a very nice way, that self-reflective way. And now you can ask that, some of the IT guys, they helped India back. It depends on the duration of how long.
Well, another way of looking at that question is saying that for a very small investment from US dollar terms, they got a very big payout in the number of very qualified, skilled Indians that came in a steady stream to Silicon Valley and filled a very big need, because let's not forget there was a push-pull here. So why did so many students come in 65? They relaxed the visa rules in 65 because Sputnik happened. And the US was flipping out because they were worried that they were going to lose the Cold War to the Russians. And so the US military invested very heavily in MIT and all these Caltech and all the educational institutions. And so they put in a lot of money, but there was a shortage of engineers. And so they went and they recruited and they relaxed the rules so that engineers from qualified countries could come in, and India had Indian-speaking, English-speaking engineers, and they had world-class institutions like the IITs. So it was a very small investment for the US, but a very big payout.
So I think Ajay has now signaled to me 3 times that we are out of time. So many questions were unanswered, but
You asked a question about what
can-
was a special ingredient. Okay, okay,
Yeah, we can have drinks and.
okay,
we'll
sure.
continue over.
All right.
So thank you very much for the wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you to this great panel. I can tell you that this book is a great read. It's available outside. Campus bookstores is provided it. It's for sale, of course, but you have the author here to sign it for you. So take a look at it. There's some very interesting. I mean, it's a delightful read. Absolutely delightful. Particularly the section on Chandrika Tandon. Who's in the book. So thank you all so much